Welcome to COVID and Climate Change Correlations, a weekly video podcast where I, Daniel Sanderson, engage in a stimulating conversation with post-Keynesian economist Steve Keen. Okay, so here we are. Welcome, everybody. We're at another show of COVID and climate correlations with Steve Keen, and again, reoccurring special guest Scott Heftler. Okay, so today we're just going to ease into the conversation, and I wanted to make an announcement that we have a special guest coming next week, and we're all excited to see Ian Dunlock come to the show next week, and So Steve, you'd mentioned that you'd met him in brief passing, I think.
Yeah, we're both Australians, which helps, and we travel a lot. So I think he's based in Melbourne. I think we've met once or twice at various functions over the years. And I wasn't working on climate change because when I saw him, I'd done some work with the what's called the United Nations Environment Program, but that was a sort of a one-off back in 2008. So I think I met Ian about that time, and I was mainly focusing upon the financial crisis at that stage. But yeah, I do know him and respect him.
Okay, well, there's a couple of things that you've said right away. The financial crisis, we want to touch on that briefly. I always love bringing that up because there's been a few, like a handful of people on the planet, it almost seems, that predict the outcome of the 2009 crash, and where all the bank bailouts and stuff had to happen, right? I don't know.
Yeah. Hey, you've become invisible.
That's my superpower.
Which is a bit like financial crises for neoclassical economists. They're actually invisible. And that's, I mean, in terms of people not predicting it, only a handful seeing it coming. I think that we've got to put that in the right context. There are only a handful of people brave enough to put up their hands and say the emperor had no clothes. Because if you had any focus on the property market or the stock market, and you're looking at the amount of borrowed money going into those markets at the time, and if you believe that was any potential source of trouble, you were warning of a crisis. And it was only I'd like to use some very strong French here, but the morons will do, the morons of mainstream economics who are disparaging anybody who said such a thing could even happen. And you were rubbished for even saying it. But the classic case of the emperor has no clothes. Only the small child who can't be intimidated is the one who said something. And in this case, it's the rebels like myself. The most prominent people who actually warned of the crisis were Robert Schiller, who has to be given quite a bit of kudos here because he's so mainstream he even has a Nobel Prize in economics. But he does historical and statistical work and was willing to stick his neck out and say that there was a crisis coming. And he was actually the source of the phrase irrational exuberance to describe the behavior on Wall Street. And then William White, Bill White, now a close friend of mine, who was at the time the research director for the Bank of International Settlements. I'm not quite certain how. I think Bill's told me, but I've forgotten. He came to be aware of Hyman Minsky's work. And while being the research director for the Bank of International Settlements, which pretty much functions as a soiree every 6 months for all the world's central bankers, he was warning of a crisis, and he was doing it in and to Greenspan's face. So those are the two people that acknowledge of authority, and then about a dozen others who stuck their neck outs as well.
Where in that picture does the belligerent Nassim Taleb, where does he fit into that picture?
I don't know that Taleb actually called the crisis, but he was somebody who, his whole focus upon chaotic markets fundamentally. And this goes back to the work of J. Edgar Peters before him. The markets are not a equilibrium process. They're not something where the normal distribution applies, and yet that's the way that it's analysed by mainstream economists. They treat the standard deviation of the daily movements on the stock market as a proxy for risk on a stock market. Now, when you roll the dice, risk is the chance that it'll turn up a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, and throw that frequently enough, and you're going to get a normal distribution of scores between 1 and 6, or 2 dies between 1 and 12. You'll get a peak at 7, and there'll be a standard deviation will describe the spread. And there's nothing beyond, you don't roll 2 dice and get a 13 or a -1. Okay, so there's known bounds to it, and that's the basis of how they treated risk. The mainstream economists did, right from Ian Sharp forward, when another guy got the Nobel Prize for garbage in that case, which was the efficient markets hypothesis. But Taleb is always saying, well, it's chaotic. And when you look at a truly chaotic distribution, something generated by a nonlinear feedback process, fundamentally, and this is something Mandelbrot established. There's no mean, and there's no standard deviation can truly be calculated. So yeah, that's what they used. And of course, so Taleb would say, well, it's nonsense, and therefore you can easily get an enormous change. A 30 and 40 standard deviation movement is feasible, whereas according to the normal distribution, anything beyond 5 standard deviations is so rare that you can rule it out. It won't happen once in the lifetime of the universe. Whereas we see 10 and 20 standard deviation movements in the data for the stock market, and they just ignore those as outliers. Well, give me a break.
Shit, Steve, this is opening up a huge can here. And the reason is well, seriously, I mean, a deviation or 2 standard deviations is ubiquitous in so much of our scientific studies. And if we talk about, pretty much, the entirety of social sciences is evaluating populations. They're doing it based off of deviations from the mean. And if humanity is this, well, how should I put it? How do we get the usefulness out of looking at that bell curve in a chaotic system? Don't we have periods of...
No, chaotic system, forget it. I mean, the thing is, standard deviations work for things like height. Okay, so like the average height of a male is about 175 centimeters. 5'8". I'm pretty much the average height. And the standard deviation is probably something of the scale of, 4 inches. So somebody who's 5'8" is in the middle. 6 foot is 1 standard deviation. 6'4" is 2 standard deviations. 6'8" is a giant. Now you don't see anybody who's 10 standard deviations above the norm. Period.
Well, and more importantly, if there was a supergiant, like somebody in the higher, sort of levels, they're not going to change the direction of our economy. Yeah, that's right. They're not a non-influencer.
Yeah, the one they are so vanishingly rare that even if they did exist, their impact upon the averages media is trivial. Whereas in the stock market, the impact of enormous events, which are 10 and 20 standard deviations. But if you actually, you can derive the statistics for standard deviation, no problem. It's just a column of numbers. What's the daily change, and you then divide the daily change into by the daily value, and bang, you've got a calculation of standard deviations in terms of percentage movements. If you think about it, we regularly report in the news when there's a movement in the stock market of 1%. Now, if you look at the standard deviation of the daily movements, I don't have the numbers in front of me. I did have this at one stage. It's about 3%. Okay, so why do we make a news story about 1%? The reason is that most of the movements are the order of 0.01 to 0.1% on a daily basis, and therefore hitting that 1%, even though it's less than the standard deviation, is big news. Now, when the stock market crashes, as it did in 1929 and in 2008 and 1987 as well, your one-day movement in the stock market can be 25%. That was the scale of movement. I think it was 20% in 1987 October. It was a Black Tuesday in October of 1987. It was a 20% fall in one day. Now, that is quite within the realm of movements in a chaotic system, but it's completely outside the realm of a system that obeys a normal distribution. But that's what neoclassical economists shoehorned it into. So if you came out claiming there was going to be a 5 or 10 standard deviation, you're mad, it can't possibly happen. Well, bang, it does.
I have a question about crisis, deficit, and debt. So how does this work in the public conversation? So on one hand, we'll acknowledge that the debt is incredibly high, and then the householder debt is even higher than that. And that's supposed to be a crisis, right? That's a real problem. On the other hand, we need to not acknowledge it in order that things continue functioning. And on the other hand, no one really believes that the Chinese will collect their debts anytime soon. So it's not really a problem. So is it a problem or isn't it?
Private debt is a problem. This is the thing this is the drum I've been banging for 15 years now. Actually, make that really, it's in 1987 when I first read Hyman Minsky, and since 1993 when I first modeled, actually 1992 I think it was, when I first modeled his financial instability hypothesis, that private debt is what matters and government debt, generally speaking, is benign because it's simply the other side. And this is what in modern monetary theory has come along and said in a different way. The scale of government debt is literally a record of the amount of government money the government has created that's still in circulation. So that's not a problem, because when the government creates, if the government creates money in its own currency and it's not running a massive trade, the country's not running a massive trade deficit, the money that it creates is a negative for itself, but a positive for the rest of the society. So by running it's recording a negative for itself, the government is recording a positive for the rest of society, putting us in positive equity. And that's something we actually want to be in. Whereas private debt, when you're a private debtor, if you get money off the government gives you money, period. Okay, the debt is something the government has to handle. If you get money off a bank, you get debt off the bank as well. You've got to handle both, and that's the danger when that debt gets too high, because you can't print your own money to pay your bank debt. That's what tends to bring you unstuck and cause financial crises.
Yeah, and of course we modeled this in a earlier episode with the software, which was really cool. I enjoyed that. Steve actually walked us through his software, or the software he uses, and kind of showed the flow of money and how debt works from the institutional side of things, and then also from the individual side of things. I think you're also summarizing or advocating towards eliminating the banks or changing the roles of the banks. Could you clarify that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I've argued for a long time for a debt jubilee. We have to write off the level of private debt, because what's actually happened because, again, mainstream economics doesn't understand money, but still lectures about how we can control money. They've basically said, no, don't worry about private debt. The private debt is a consenting act between adults. Just like you shouldn't regulate bedrooms, you shouldn't regulate private debt. That's the way they think about it. And because they've done that and they're wrong, the analogy for private debt is not what happens inside your bedroom, but what happens inside your neighborhood brothel. Okay, and the banks are actually producing the money and producing the debt at the same time, and it's in their interest to generate as much debt as possible, because that's how they profit, by creating debt. And then you get the stage where not everybody, but a large part of the society is in debtor's prison, fundamentally. And then when you're in debtor's prison, metaphorically speaking, you don't spend because you're worried about paying your debt down. And what you get is the economy, even if it doesn't crash, slows down because people are more worried about paying down their debt. Therefore, they spend more slowly. Therefore, your money turns over less frequently, and you have a slowdown in the economic growth. But then you become dependent. And this is more like to forget the brothel, the better analogy is the drug, is somebody pushing heroin. You become dependent on that flow of debt. So in America's case, credit went from of the order of 5% of GDP back in the 1950s and 60s to 15% before the crisis. And then when credit turned negative, demand collapsed. It went from plus 15 to minus 5% of GDP over a 2-year period. And that's what caused the financial crisis. So that is the real worry. And we need to get that debt down, first of all. But once we do, we can't let the banks go back to the same form of behavior, because, again, they'll provide money to pump up asset bubbles. We'll fall into them, borrowing the money to gamble on the rising asset prices. We'll make money while the credit's going up, but then either crash or get trapped in what I call credit stagnation, which is where we are now. So I want to effectively abolish the most profitable forms of bank lending, and that is lending to finance asset bubbles.
Yeah. That's really very interesting, Steve. I'm curious. In you're an outlier, anyways, because as a contrarian economist, but you're familiar with other economists, right? In your field. So
unfortunately, I reckon they owe me 30 years of my life having to read their shit.
So this next question is this question is about your assessment. Or your statement that the debt crisis, that the collapse of 2009 was caused by the excessive debt and then it going negative, right? So it going from 5 to 15 and then going negative, and it just flipped, and that was the reason for the crash. So is this a consensus across all economists, or is
fuck no.
No,
they're still ignoring it. I mean, this is what totally pisses me off. It was bad enough to ignore the stuff before the crisis. They continue ignoring it after. Actually, it might help if I load that software again to put a bit of a pause or edit the. Okay. So give me a couple of minutes to get that up again, and I can just show you all the countries in the world where this applies, which of course means all the countries in the world where they're ignoring this and still ignoring it even after the crisis hit. So give me a couple of minutes.
Sure. Okay. So the official story is that it was the subprime mortgage lending hedge funds that caused the crash, right? People were betting on the inability to pay these things back, and that caused the thing. And you're saying it's something deeper than that. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's true. It is fundamentally the level of private debt and the fact that you have a economy which becomes dependent upon credit, and then it crashes because credit goes negative. And that according to mainstream economics should have no, and I'm literally quoting Bernanke here, pure redistributions, which is what they see private debt as, should have no significant macroeconomic effects. That's a direct quote from Bernanke. And it's completely wrong, because when you look at the data alone, you find that that's just totally false. So I'll just if I can just show them. Are you still recording there?
Yeah, we're still recording, so I can turn on at any time.
Okay, so here we go. So this is my Ravel software, which is a commercial product I'm working on. It sits on top of Minsky now. And this is private debt to GDP ratio. So that's what you're seeing on this chart here. And down here, this is the annual change in debt divided by GDP. So this is effectively this is credit demand, because new debt is credit, okay? And credit demand as a percentage of GDP is what's been charted down here. And you can see that the financial crisis, you have credit being 15% of GDP, and then it falls down here to about minus 5% of GDP. Now that's the United States. Let's go take a look at the UK. Same story. Turkey, later. Turkey had a bit of it, but you can see Turkey's hassles turning up over here.
My guess was Canada was lagged a bit too.
There's Thailand during the Asian financial crisis. Let's go another one. Switzerland managed to have its crisis at another stage. Sweden, financial crisis. They're going back. Spain's one of the classics, from plus 35% to minus 20%. Okay. So this is just a global phenomenon. When you get the global data, you find it turning up in all of these countries. Singapore, again, during the Asian financial crisis rather than this time round. You mentioned Canada. Let's take a look at Canada. Hang on a second. Moving a mouse is a lot of fun. There goes Canada. Okay, so there's your decline. You didn't go negative, and neither did Australia. So you went from 16% to about 3%, and Australia did a similar thing. And that's why those countries didn't have a crisis. They managed to prevent credit continuing to fall. But the price of that credit continuing to fall was an astronomical level of debt. So there's Australia going from 25% to 5%, and then going and remaining positive all the way through. But what has come out as a result of that is that its debt levels are now even higher than they were during the financial crisis. Or if you compare that to America, then it's debt levels fell after the financial crisis. And even with COVID, they're not back to the same scale they were during the financial crisis. So this is a global phenomenon. Every country that has had a financial crisis, it's been caused by the private sector, not by the government sector.
You know, if there's ever a viral video, or a video that should go viral, don't you think this is one of them? I mean, this is like a debt jubilee. Come on, guys! Like, let's everybody get behind this. I don't know if people know what that means, right? It's like,
yeah,
your debt gets wiped off, guys.
Yeah, I mean,
your wife
it's actually. The funny thing is, I mean, I didn't expect this. So, see, when I first proposed a debt write-off, the reaction I got back from people was, "Oh, that is unfair," because anybody who didn't borrow money and gamble during the financial crisis doesn't get affected, and they're effectively penalised by not. You let the debtors off the debt, but you don't let people who save money rather than being a debtor. Now, I was actually one of the latter camp. So I agree. It's the issue, right? We can't do it in the old-fashioned way of just writing off debts. And if you go back and look at Michael Hudson's research on this, and also David Graeber's, and all the people who've worked in anthropology and archaeology looking at what happened in ancient societies where jubilees are a part of the story. The jubilees were introduced by the Sumerian kings, and they were restricted to household debt. So you didn't write off commercial debt. You did write off household debt, and a lot of that household debt, frankly, was acquired from drinking. You go to a mead hall and you'd be drinking on credit. And in the idea you'd pay it back when the harvest came in, and the harvest wouldn't come in. You'd end up a debt slave. And then when the reason that the Sumerian king brought them in is only freemen could be part of the Sumerian army. So as the number of debt slaves increased, the stock of people who could man the army declined, and therefore the empire was likely to get destroyed because of private debt. So I think quite literally there were some executions of moneylenders early on, but then it became institutionalized that every 7 times 7, so 49 years, or every change of ruler, which was about 20 years, there would be a debt jubilee, and that would reset the books. Now, you can't do that today. So what you can do is you can have a modern debt jubilee where you create government-based money and use that to replace credit-based money. And then everybody gets the same per capita amount. And when you do it, I didn't think this was possible, but I've done another, I can show you that model if you like, and we can look in that and explore that. But it's possible to set up a debt jubilee in such a way that everybody benefits. Okay, even the banks, and the economy gets stimulated by it. Even if there's no change in people's behaviour, the economy gets stimulated by reducing the level of private debt. So shall I show that?
Yeah.
Okay, hang on.
I think this would be interesting to talk about, Steve, as Canada spent a lot of money in a COVID relief campaign because we had a Liberal government in power. And so the idea from the Conservatives is that they say, oh, you've just spent all this money, we've got to pay it back. You've spent all this money, we've got to pay it back. But how do we make the case that that spending to keep people, sustained through this, COVID time? How do we make the case financially? Like, what would we say?
Well, you have to explain that the government, and you can quote Bernanke and Greenspan on this one, at least this they got right. The government has an infinite capability to create money, whether that's by the central bank doing it or by the Treasury doing it. And when it does so, it's creating money in its own currency. So because the government owns its own bank, it doesn't face the same problems the rest of us do of not owning our own bank. If you could borrow money from yourself and spend it, and other people accepted that, I reckon you'd do it, don't you?
Yeah, it's kind of like that invisibility thing.
Yeah.
That philosophical thing.
Yeah.
You could turn invisible, right? Would you turn into like a horrible person?
Well, you would, but the thing is, if you're a horrible person and everybody accept your money, you'd actually be a source of prosperity. If everybody else used your money for their own transactions. So what I've got on screen here, and I know it's very complicated to look at, I'll make it a bit larger. What I have is the basic operations up here are the basic things that happen in a capitalist economy. So you have firms paying dividends, paying interest on the debt they've got, capitalists consuming, capitalists paying interest on the debt they've got, workers getting paid wages, workers paying interest on the debt they've got, workers consuming, and then banks consuming. So that's basically a free enterprise section up the top there. And then what I show is the government creating a jubilee by putting money in workers' bank accounts and putting money in capitalist bank accounts, and then insisting that that money has to be used to repay debt by workers and by capitalists. And then if there's anybody who still has money, has no debt to repay, they have to buy newly issued corporate shares, which then produces a dividend flow for them, of course, after they've done it. And that reduces corporate debt. So you'd reduce household debt of workers and capitalists, you reduce corporate debt, and then you'd sell bonds to finance it. And the sale of the bonds would mean interest is paid to the banks. That means the banks, rather than getting interest up here from all these sectors, where the debt has now fallen, they get interest from the government instead. And I'll quickly run them. Brace yourself, they're going to look pretty weird on the screens you guys have got. But this is, I'll bring up one of the key, probably the key graph here is the level of debt. So I've set this model up so that it's aping the situation for America with the level of government debt and household debt and corporate debt. And what you get after the debt jubilee occurs is a fall in the level of, hang on, I chose the wrong one there, I think. Yeah, you get a fall in the level of debt. So this is I'll just show the results of the simulation once it runs through here. But this, you start with the level of private debt, which is too high. The government then declares a jubilee at the fourth year. So government debt goes up, but private debt falls quite radically in terms of a ratio of GDP. And then over time, even the government's debt is lower after the jubilee than it was before. And the reason for this is that the amount of money in the economy remains constant, but the rate at which it turns over goes up radically. I've got a change in the money supply here because the money paid to banks, the interest paid to banks actually creates money. But even if I leave out interest payments to banks, you get a fall in the level of debt. And what's going on is you're redistributing money away from the bankers to the workers. And because workers spend much more rapidly than bankers do, you get an increase in the level of turnover of money, and therefore your denominator, your GDP, rises faster than your debt level rises. You actually have a falling numerator, so your debt level's going down, and a rising denominator, so the ratio is going down even faster. And the aggregate level of debt falls. So I started the simulation at roughly the level of aggregate American government plus private debt, which is about 280% of GDP. And by the end of the simulation, it was below 100%. So you could actually, using a modern debt jubilee, you can actually reduce the debt ratio, not just for the private sector, but also for the government.
Oh, I feel sad because I was going to say, what about jubilees? And then Steve said jubilees right away, so I missed my moment of glory, my moment of looking like I was understanding what the hell was going on. I like these graphs. I like the software. And I would just wish I took a macro class, wish I took a micro class. Yeah.
No, mate, don't waste your time. They're a waste of. You might as well go and drink lead. I mean, it'll do the same thing to your brain.
Well, I like to do an overview so that I could instantly have a quick understanding of all the terms. I mean, it takes me a while to digest.
You would learn none of that. You would learn none of this in a standard macro course. None of it. Okay, they'd be teaching you supply and demand. They'd be teaching you a barter model of the economy. That's why they're so dangerous and misleading. They don't. Most of them have no understanding of the accounting behind banking. And frankly, I didn't. To be honest, when I first started building Minsky, which takes me back to about 2005 or 6, I think. I'm not really sure when I first started working on the concepts behind it. But I was using single entry bookkeeping. And then as we built Minsky, I realized we had to have double entry. And then Minsky taught me the software about double entry. And now I think I understand banking probably better than, there might be one or two people on the planet who understand it better than me. But, I probably know them anyway. And Whereas my profession, so-called discipline, economics, completely ignores banking, and all the comments it makes about banking are based on a let's assume a can opener argument about banking that makes banking either a transfer between one person and another. So I lend you money and you've got more money and I've got less, and I spend less and you spend more, that sort of analogy. Or they treat it effectively as though money is like a commodity. And therefore, when you put it in the bank, there's less elsewhere, et cetera, et cetera. And for people to have more of it, the bank's got to lend out the actual physical money. The only neoclassical understands this is Michael Kumoff at the Bank of England. Michael's a good friend, close mate. And Michael's analogy is that the way that the neoclassicals model money is a bit like gravel. You know, you have a gravel warehouse and you have some gravel you don't need. So rather than using it in your own backyard, you dump it in the bank, and then the bank lends that gravel out to somebody else. And that's how they see it. Whereas money is an accounting entity. It is a obligation between a three-way obligation between a borrower, somebody who is a recipient of money being spent by the borrower, and the bank. And that understanding is completely absent in mainstream economics. And you are at a university, aren't you? Physically?
No.
You're not?
I live next to UT, but I'm not teaching there anymore.
Well, why don't you walk in and sit in the macro class? Nobody'd kick you out. You know what it's like. You just walk inside and say you're auditing the class from the point of view of a philosopher, that sort of thing.
Right, that's a good idea.
Okay, and just go in and sit and see what they. And don't make a nuisance of yourself. Just come along here and make a nuisance of yourself by video later.
Maybe is there a book that you can recommend that is just like a massive overview of all the concepts and the standard models?
Well, there's My Debunking Economics, which is an overview. You can get a copy for if you want. If you don't want to, I would not spend money on anything written by a neoclassical economist. So search on the web and see if you can find a copy of Mankiw's Macroeconomics. Okay, you'll find a PDF somewhere, and take a look at that, and that will give you. Most of the lectures these days simply people reproducing the PowerPoint slides from Mankiw and that sort of mob. Yeah. So go and check. I would see what textbook they use at your local university, and you might well find the odds are pretty high. It'll be Mankiw or Blinder. A few others. There are a few others out there, and then just see if you can find a copy of that. Get a PDF of it and do it and look at the section on money, and you'll see what I'm talking about.
So is this Minsky software available, or is there something else? Oh yeah, like
there's nothing else like it, and this is available. Again, I'll get a bit more screen share. We're talking a bit about Minsky here, so let's. So
you're developing something that runs on Minsky, is that right?
Well, the one I've shown you a moment ago is called Ravel. That's I've actually just got a patent for it. I'm very happy to say. So and that will be a commercial product, and that's for data analysis and handling large-scale multidimensional data. But this is Minsky. Which is at SourceForge. So I don't know if you can actually. I'm sharing my screen. Yeah, okay. So this is the SourceForge site for Minsky, and you just click on download, and you've got the software, and it will do all the analysis that I showed in this model. Okay, so it'll do that stuff if you want to go that complicated, but it won't do this work, which is doing the empirical analysis. So yeah.
So Minsky knows the rate of spending if you increase worker lending by such and such, and there's some known ratio of outflow. I mean, where do these numbers come from?
Okay, good point. The numbers come from anything you can find empirical data on. The trouble is that because statisticians are directed by the dominant strand of the discipline that tells them which data to collect. They don't collect data, for example, on workers' bank accounts and capitalist bank accounts. And of course, it's very easy to find data on workers if you want to, because workers can't hide what they've got. And they haven't got very much either. Whereas capitalists are very good at hiding where their money is and how much they've got. So it'd be a hard job doing it anyway. So you can find, for example, like the aggregate. I can tell you this actually. The aggregate amount of money in just give me a chance to bring up another window here. The aggregate amount of money in capitalist bank accounts or in firms' bank accounts in America is roughly $6.5 trillion. The amount of money in household accounts is roughly 16.5 trillion. Okay, so we know that because that data is collected at that level. But if you want to find out how much is in workers' bank accounts and capitalists, you can't. Okay?
And that data that you just cited about the 16 and the 6, where is that listed? Is there some repository on the internet of shared information?
It's called the flow of funds. Well, it was called the flow of funds. It's and this is actually one of the great statistical contributions of American the government sector. The guy called Copeland, I've forgotten his first name, but Copeland, who was sort of a proto post-Keynesian, a bit like my approach to economics. He was given the task of setting up the analysis of financial transfers in America after the Second World War. And he established the flow of funds. And as part of that, they record in very great detail private lending and financial flows.
So every bank has the responsibility of having it's like an onboard census contract. Everyone have to volunteer the information out.
That's right, yeah, and it's published every quarter. So that's an extremely useful database, which I've made enormous use of over time, but it doesn't provide like detail on social classes and the amount of money they've got. So what I do when I model in Minsky, I simply make an assumption that is like a reasonable rule of thumb. And the reasonable rule of thumb is if you're a worker, you haven't got much money, so the amount of money you do have gets turned over rather rapidly. Okay, if you look at your bank account and look at how much you spend on a year, and what's the ratio going to be? You know, for a lot of workers, they'd be lucky to have, you know, I think a pretty rare worker in America had $10,000 in cash. Okay, in terms of a bank account, deposit account. How much they spend? 30, 40, 50,000 a year, maybe. More likely, you're likely to be a couple of. Most people say they couldn't afford 2 or 3 major bills, you know, like $1,000. So a lot of workers would, on average, have about $1,000 in their bank account and spend 30,000 a year. That gives you a 30-to-1 spending ratio, which means if you didn't get income coming in within 2 weeks, you wouldn't be able to spend. Okay, so that's I use that as my sort of number for workers. Whereas bankers, I mean, if bankers, you know, suddenly the money supply coming into bankers cut off, how long do you reckon they could survive for? 20 years, 30 years? So you get a capacity to spend more slowly, even though you spend huge amounts of money. You know, you go out and buy a luxury yacht every now and then, and you've got a palatial house and servants, blah blah blah. But the proportion that consumes of your actual cash reserves or assets relatively small. So I use that sort of rule of thumb. And if I actually had if my approach to economics took over the discipline, then I'd be making damn sure that that statisticians started doing dividing up bank account data according to income level, for example.
That's great that you mentioned that. Yeah. In my Marxism class at Duke, some of the students complained, can you really make a distinction anymore between capitalists and working class? Every worker that has a share in AT&T, aren't they kind of capitalists? And all is capitalists. Don't they kind of do work on the weekends in their gardens? There's no difference anymore between worker and capitalists. And then the professor said, actually, here's a test. This is just a rough test.
Yeah, yeah.
If you don't work for a year and nothing happens to you, you're a capitalist.
That's and
so I like that. I tell that to people when they're taking introductory Marxism classes, because it seems confusing. Doesn't it seem confusing that the class distinctions aren't really here anymore? So it's a good rule of thumb to help people.
Yeah, yeah. If
it's the one that you just used. It's a how long does it take before your funds run out? That's the criteria.
Exactly. That's precisely what I use. So like I'm borrowing a lot of concepts from engineering as well when I do my modeling. So engineers use what's called a time constant. And that is, and normally is a constant because they'll design something so that it has a constant rate of change. But what you're looking at is, if you have a spring, you say, how fast will the spring return to its unweighted length once you take a weight off? And that's the time that it retracts is called the time constant. And like you have a very, like you imagine the springs you have in a car and you're going along the road and you don't want to get, kicked in the arse each time you hit a bump or on the road, then you want a very fast time constant for that spring. If you're designing the, what is it called, the Mechazilla, that's going to catch the booster rocket when it falls out of when it comes out of the sky, okay? You want it to be slow, okay? So your time constant is slow. So what you do is you take the number, like the amount of money in your bank account, and you divide it by a number that says how many standard time units would it take for you to run this down to zero. So for a worker, you have, say, let's say you got $1,000 in your bank account, and you would spend that in 2 weeks. Okay, well, two weeks is roughly 1/25th of a year. Okay, so you divide that 1,000 by 1/25th, and you spend $25,000 per year. Okay, and then of course in that case, your lovely analogy there about the okay, how long could you say? How long before you're homeless? Answer 2 weeks, maybe 4. A capitalist, 2 centuries, maybe 4 millennium. And yes, there is a class system.
Yeah. Well, it heartened me to hear you use that same distinction, because sometimes people think these analyses, that these don't work, and these old analyses are for back in the old industrial. Things were bad back then. Marx was right, but now there's really no class distinction. We're all working together in the same buildings. I mean, there's wage differences, but is there really a working class and an owning class?
I know. Yeah, I mean, in my own profession, again, is guilty of that. I mean, the classic thing is they claim they're being apolitical. Bullshit. They're being political by hiding the existence of enormous income and wealth disparities. And in fact, we know when you look at the data, and this is where Thomas Piketty, and I must again take my hat off to him for his empirical research. And I'm also dealing with him right now, by the way, for a talk commemorating David Graeber's death in a couple of weeks' time, and he's been superb. I've got some criticisms of some of his work, but I've got to say his empirical work is top class, and he's been a very, very decent human being over this exercise with David. But Piketty has shown the inequality now is greater than the inequality that applied back in the Gilded Age in the 1800s. So it just isn't as visible, because to be part of the aristocracy, the aristocracy of capitalism in the 1860s, if you wanted to get away from the mob, it's a question of how fast could you horse ride, okay? Now if you're going to go away from the mob, it's how fast can your personal jet take you to an island off the coast of another continent, So it is much, much more hidden, but very much
That's
there.
right. Yeah. I have a friend who's taking she took a Marxism class last semester in Hawaii.
Yeah.
And then the student said, "Where is this impoverished working class? We don't see it. These people have these homeless shelters." And then he said, "It's offshore now. The people that are doing the industrial work, they're not in the U.S. They're off in China, where they're propping their eyelids open with pins and sending the money to their parents off in the rice paddies."
Yeah, I mean, it's China's done pretty well out of that. And like I'm living in a third world country now, and there's some pretty damn hard. I mean, we had a couple of 70-year-olds fixing up the plumbing in our house. Like I'm approaching 70, and I'm probably close to that guy's physical strength. But Jesus, I wouldn't want the job. You have people have to work, and we gave them a tip of equivalent of about $20 and they were delighted by that. And a married couple, and the husband in the 70s, wife in her 60s. People work a lot harder over here than they do in the West, and that's partly where the benefit for the West comes from. But there are plenty of, the working class poor in America. This is what throws me about the country. They're swallowing this, USA ideology, not realizing how they're getting screwed.
Yeah, that's one of the great puzzles is how do you convince, and how have the Republicans successfully convinced poor white workers in America to vote Republican? And the answer seems to be race resentment and the joy of racial punishment. I can't think of anything else.
To some extent. At the same time, the progressive left abandoned them in a place of identity politics rather than working class politics. I think I was I was actually fighting against that back in the 70s in Australia with the Australian Labor Party, which actually led the way in saying that we're going to show how to be better managers of the economy and beat the conservatives that way. And as soon as they made that mistake, it was a hiding to nothing for the Tories to take over.
In fact, a woman in my department, that was her dissertation topic, is what has been the strategy that the Republicans have used, besides hiding wealth and pretending we're on the same team and having capitalists wear cowboy hats and baseball caps and go to NASCAR races and act like they're one of the boys. Besides that, how do you convince someone to vote against their own economics? Don't these poor white people know, these trailer park people know? Don't they know that Trump despises them? Don't they know that Trump will screw them, and then if Republicans win the country, that it's going to shift more money away from labor towards capitalists? Surely they know this, and surely they know the Democrat will at least try a little bit to increase wages, a little bit, healthcare a little bit. So in every possible way, it hurts them, but they do it anyway. There must be some type of metaphysical, spiritual identity politics.
Oh yeah, and the whole the obsession with freedom in America as well, which to me means freedom without responsibility, from what I've seen. But yeah, the pushing of this ideology of freedom. Thank God you're free. Look at those poor, enslaved people in Soviet Russia, which is no longer Soviet. We're still using the same bloody excuse and demonizing Putin. Oh, I look at this stuff and
you could be a slave. You want to be like those slaves in Sweden and Denmark? Look at them.
Or Amsterdam, where I used to live. Yeah,
you do not want socialized medicine. You're not going to get a doctor of your choice. It's not worth the loss of freedom.
Yeah.
So let me interrupt now. We got 10 minutes left, and you brought up Graeber. I'd like to talk about him, his book, his I guess service, or what his friends are doing in commemoration of his untimely death. And anything you want to say to kind of wrap up the last 10 minutes might be appropriate.
Yep. Well, that's the function of the Royal Society of the Arts, which is an august institution in the UK, and they are putting on the debate between Thomas Piketty and Michael Hudson, and the topic is fundamentally. I can bring it up. They call it the Great Debt Debate. I'll just actually again share my screen so I can share this around. So hang on a second. Okay, so this is it, the Great Debt Debate. It's on the 23rd, and that's 6 p.m. UK time. There might be a change in the time because they got things wrong for Thomas. Thomas has another commitment, so the time might change slightly. But this is the website, and I'll just take a copy of that and blow it up so people can see the text more clearly. So hang on a second. So that's the website. So the RSA, www.the.RSA, and the rest is pretty obvious. Events 2021-09, the Great Debt Debate. And if you go to that, that will bring you up to this page, and you can register. And it'll be Thomas Piketty. And Thomas's position is fundamentally you've got to tax the rich, because his argument is that the rate of interest in capitalism exceeds the rate of growth, and that therefore leads to the wealthy accumulating more than the poor. And his solution is fundamentally to tax the rich to transfer that money back to the rest of the population. Michael, who's the person who's done the most to argue for a debt jubilee, argues you've got to write the debt off. And his classic phrase is, debts that can't be repaid won't be repaid. So they're going to put the two perspectives together. Nika Dabrowski is David's widow and a close friend. And then, so she'll open the discussion, and then I'll finish it. And it'll be about 1 hour. We're going to keep it pretty tight. So it'll have an opening statement from Nika, Thomas and Michael both making their basic cases in about 5, maybe 10 minutes, then commenting on each other, then an open discussion, and then I'll finish with a few minutes about David and what's going to happen next in the events that Nika has put together under what she calls the Fight Club for these discussions, and the Museum of Care in general for continuing Michael's work, for David's work.
So can you explain a little bit about his anthropological work? Because he was quite famous in that field as it relates to economics.
Well, it's fundamentally, I mean, a lot of his field research occurred in Madagascar, as it happens. And what he was looking at is modern myths and where do they come from, was a large part of it, and how does human society evolve. He has a new book just coming out. I think it's already out, actually. I've got to buy a copy of it, with another David. I can't think of David's last. The other David. I think there's two of them, but another anthropologist, a stroke historian. And what they're saying is that that the human society has always had some level of hierarchy to it. So we tend to have this vision of 97% of a history where we had egalitarian societies, and then the last 3% where we have hierarchical societies. In fact, there are hierarchies all the way through, but from one of the differences is that the hierarchies would be formed by aggregating tribes at winter and summer festivals. So if you had like the average size of a community in the Neolithic days was about 150 people. This is what's called the Dunbar number. When people look at how many people lived in a particular grouping, it maxed out at about 150. And there's cognitive reasons behind that. How many relationships can you keep track of? And the answer is about 150 for our brain size. For marmosets, it's about 30 in a marmoset, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, that's far too small a gene pool for obvious reasons. And what would happen, there'd be distributed groups, maybe say 7,000 in a whole group of different tribes, and they would then come together at winter and summer festivals. And at those winter and summer festivals, you would have a king and queen, and they would change on a regular basis. But nonetheless, there was some sense of hierarchy, some sense of status. And then a huge part of that was the levels of trust that had to happen to make those communities function. And then what happened with the progression to agricultural societies initially was that trust became encapsulated by the religious institutions. And those religious institutions became the basis of both the state and the banking system. And credit grew out of those institutions. That's a very, very potted and over-the-place summary, but that's the sort of stuff David was into. And what he found was today, because of economics and its dominance in how people think, he said, even in Madagascar, people believed that money evolved out of barter. He said, when you look at their history and you look at histories all around the world, you can find virtually no examples. Well, actually, you can find no examples of a society functioning on barter. The only instances they could find of barter were trades between two neighbouring societies which were warlike towards each other. And therefore, barter would take place as a sort of ritual thing, partly to exchange things that one group couldn't make that the other could, but B, also to be a way of reducing the tension to stop war breaking out. So barter was not the foundation of human social trade. The foundation of social trade was credit. And that goes right back to the pre-Sumerian days.
Well, that's fascinating.
Well, that's news to me, because they usually teach, back in the old days, it was CMC. And the important thing was getting C to C. And M wasn't really that important. The M was just there because squirrel meat rots, but bananas rot. But gold or seashells or glass beads, these don't. And it was only a mediating device. It was a transparent medium, and that's all it was.
That's people have only read the first chapter, the first volume of Marx's Capital, who swallow that on the left. And this is what I forgot who De Bruynhoff, was it De Bruynhoff who wrote Marx on Money? And Marx quite literally said he was using commodity money simply to remove the complications caused by money in that first volume. And then in the future developments, all this needs to become fluid.
I see. Okay. It was like it was a place-holding, simplifying assumption. It
was a placeholder. Susan de Bruynhoff, that's right. It was a placeholding thing. It was not his overall theory of money. And yet in typical fashion for Marxist scholars, and I use the word with some disparaging tone, I'm afraid to say, they ossified that into Marx's theory of money. And if you read volume 2 and 3 of Capital and the Grundrisse and the theories of surplus value, you find he had a credit theory of money, which he didn't fully develop, but it was there. And so there was, Marx was far richer than Marx was once asked a bunch of young enthusiasts, what is a Marxist? And when they explained it to him, he said, in that case, I'm not a Marxist.
Right. I remember that's Rick Rodriguez used that one. He's like, when people call me a Marxist, I say, yes, I'm a Marxist, in the same sense that Marx was when he said that he wasn't one. That was his famous line. Yeah.
Yeah.
Here's a question. Isn't it true that the function of the government since Keynes and the Great Depression has been just to prevent the capitalist class from wreaking havoc and destroying the working class? Haven't been there as like a buffer mechanism to make sure that not all the value flows from labor to capital? Isn't that their job?
To some extent, yeah. I mean, they get it wrong, and Marx has also described them as the managing committee of the ruling class. But one thing that the managing committee of the ruling class wants to make sure is that capitalism doesn't sink. So when you
don't want revolutions. You have to treat. You have to give the workers some extra spending money, some health care. Otherwise, they get too angry. You won't have any. They'll go on strike. So
but the more you reduce your dependence upon your own working class to produce output, the less it tends to worry you. And of course, America, by outsourcing its production as much as they handle to globalization, really think they can forget about the working class. Well, you can to some degree for some extended period of time, but ultimately, if you keep it up, you're going to get, well, not necessarily a revolution, but you might get an election result you don't like. So that pushes in the opposite direction. And also, when it looks like your own colleagues might go down, that's when you really try to rescue capitalism. And as a result, you throw something to the workers at the same time, which is what happened after 2008.
What do they throw at them?
Unemployment benefits and cash for clunkers and stuff like that.
Okay.
All right. Well, I mean, we're right at the top of the hour. I'm gonna, sign off. Steve, you want to say goodbye? Scott, too.
Yep.
That's it for this episode. Stay with me, the three of you, just for a few minutes after. And thanks again for another hour with us, Professor Keen.